Well, while we wait for the rest of the group to come in, I just wanted to draw your attention to the website of the IPCC. And I wanted to mention, you probably know this, but just to make sure that we all are at the same level, IPCC has produced already 5 reports, and the 6th report is about to start next year. Okay, so we had a meeting about 2 months ago in Ethiopia. There's somebody from Ethiopia here, no? Yeah. So we were in Addis Ababa, doing the scoping, meaning the content, the proposal content for the 6th report. So the 6th report is supposed to start next year, and it's going to last 4 years. So it's going to start in 2018, and it's going to be ready by 2022. So it takes 4 years to produce a report. And with that report, there is a chance for you to participate at different levels. You could be nominated as an author. The focal point in your country needs to nominate you if you want to participate as an author. If you are not selected as an author, you can still be a contributing author if one of the authors asks you to write a piece for the report. But even if you're not an author, you could be a reviewer. So there are at least 3 stages of review for the process. And any expert, and you are experts in climate change, can register as reviewer. So you just go into the website, register your name, and then you can go in and review any part of the report that you want. So I encourage you to do that. The more people that read these reports, the better these reports can come out. So be aware that probably by the end of next year, they're gonna have the first draft of the report that can go out for review. And certainly in 2019 and 2020, there's gonna be the opportunity to review the drafts of the report to be produced. Other than the 6th assessment report, IPCC is also working in 4 other reports. This one is one that has called a lot of attention, a special report on the impacts of 1.5 degree. And you're going to talk a lot about this on Saturday, I understand, Friday and Saturday. 1.5 degrees was the political objective that was discussed during the Paris Agreement. No, the idea was to try to force countries to commit to as much mitigation as possible, and so the idea was to try to keep the warming of the planet to 1.5 degrees. It is a tricky report to produce because, like we said in the morning, we already have 1 degree of warming. So 1.5 degrees means only half a degree more to what we have already. So half a degree is very little increment. So it's very difficult to assess what's going to happen with half a degree increment. So the group working on this report are finding that they have very little literature to report on. But basically, the drive behind this report was more political. People wanted to emphasize the point that if we really try hard, we could get to 1.5 degrees limit. In my opinion, it would be almost impossible to keep the warming to 1.5 degrees. Most likely will come to 2 degrees. But still, it was a good objective to keep in Paris, to keep the warming below 1.5 degrees. So IPCC is trying to assess what the impacts would be if we are able to do our best and keep our warming to the lowest possible. There's another special report on ocean and cryosphere, and another report on land. So these 2 are special topics, and these 2 reports, the 3 reports will be finished before the 6th assessment report is completed. And so it is expected that these 3 reports will provide additional information to complete the 6th assessment report. And also important to remember is that the IPCC is also in charge of producing the methodologies to measure emissions of greenhouse gases. So IPCC has 3 working groups and 1 special group to develop methodologies to measure emissions of greenhouse gases. And so that special group is also working in coming up with improved methodologies for measuring emissions. And that's supposed to be due in 2019. So hopefully we'll have better ways to try to measure whether countries are doing what they are supposed to be doing in terms of emission reduction. Okay, and just one more thing here. Let me see. So here are the 4 reports from 2014, the 5th assessment report. Group number 1. Oh, what happened? Here it is. Group number 1, group number 2, group number 1, group number 2, group number 3. So climate science, adaptation, mitigation, and the synthesis report, this one over here. The synthesis report is the only report that is actually approved line by line by all country representatives. And so the material in the other reports is really based on the assessment of the scientific literature. And the authors are more or less free to write about that literature. But when it comes to the synthesis report, that synthesis report is written by scientists, but it's approved by government representatives in the plenary. And so I haven't been there, but I hear that it's a very painful process in which they go line by line, and countries have the possibility of saying, well, I don't agree with that line. Can we consider removing that line? And so the synthesis report is a mixture of scientific information with some veto process from the government. And so it's a mixture of a scientific report with some political twist to it. And so some people are not very happy with that because it's not a purely scientific report. It's not a purely political report. It's a mixture. And so some people say, well, this is not good because it's not really science, it's not policy. But that's the best attempt that we have to try to bring the science as close as possible to policymakers. No? So we have to sacrifice a little bit of the scientific purity, if you want, if you wish, to produce a report that is more appealing to policymakers. And so that synthesis report not only is approved line by line by all the country representatives, but it's the only part of the report that is published in all United Nations languages. And so the rest of the reports are only published in English. And that's a big limitation, no? For example, I participated in the chapter on Central and South America. So that chapter is geared towards countries who mainly speak Spanish, and of course Brazil, Portuguese. But the chapter is written in English. And so if we want to show that to policymakers in the area, we have that big limitation. We only have that chapter in English. And so language is still a big limitation in IPCC. The only part of the report that is translated, again, is the synthesis report and the summaries within that synthesis report. And that's why this report becomes very important. This is the one that is really widely distributed, and that's the report that is more cited, more than the rest of the reports, because it's the only one that is available in different languages. Okay, so let's go back to our presentation and our discussion. We were talking about adaptation planning. We were talking about planning at the national level and also planning at the local level, of subnational level. And we were saying that we need to have a combination of both national and subnational and local plans, and we need to make sure that they line up as much as possible. That's not necessarily the case oftentimes, and that's often a limitation on implementation of the plans. We were saying also that the more local the plan, the better, at least in theory, because the more local the plan, the more suited to the local conditions and the local knowledge the plan will be. A couple of slides on implementation before we move on to the next section. Again, for implementation, the biggest limitation is governance, or how different institutions are organized at different levels. And we heard some examples in the morning that implementation is very difficult because oftentimes we don't have a good communication both in the vertical direction and also in the horizontal direction. Now, barriers and enablers include, again, multi-level coordination, being able to coordinate top and down and bottom up. Key actors and advocates initiating and sustaining momentum for adaptation actions. This is important. No? Implementation usually takes key actors and advocates. So usually what we need is to have people, not institutions, taking charge of the planning and of the implementation of the plan. So institutions are important, but at the end of the day, individuals make the difference. Now, if we have a specific person within the government or within an organization who is really interested in the topic, who really believes that this needs to be done, then that person is going to take charge and is going to try to move things forward. And that's usually when we see more things happening, when we have key actors taking charge of this implementation. Horizontal interplay is also important, not only vertical. Communication, for example, like we were saying, among different government offices, the Ministry of Agriculture talking to the Ministry of Environment. Ideally, you would think that they would always talk, but they don't. And so just opening those channels for communication might make a big difference in implementing an adaptation plan. And then there's a political situation also. We were saying, for example, how climate change oftentimes is seen as an environmental problem, and oftentimes environmental problems are given a low priority in the problems of the country. And so there's sometimes this barrier of political implementation. And the barrier can be small or large. The implementation can depend a lot on the head of the state. No, we see that a lot. Different countries changing drastically on how they implement their climate change policies depending on who is in charge in the government. And finally, we will also talk about coordination with government and other stakeholders. Again, something that can be very tricky and something that doesn't happen naturally. Somebody has to be there promoting that coordination, promoting that communication with government officials and leaders from other sectors. So again, we have the situation in which we need to start thinking of specific actions to be implemented in the near future, thinking about problems that will happen in the long term. So that can be tricky, but that's the goal. No? Convincing policymakers, convincing decision makers that we need to start taking small steps or big steps now to try to think or prepare for problems that will happen much later, right? And so that's the tricky part. Think about short-term decisions that will affect the long-term process of impacts by climate change. Now, another important issue with implementation is funding. That's another thing that I didn't mention about the planning in Guatemala. With the planning in Guatemala, every year, now we are in the 4th year of trying to come up with a plan. Every year we are rushing and we are saying, okay, we need to have this plan by August. No? August is our deadline. And the reason is because in August, the government starts producing the budget for the next year. So we have the dream that if we finish the plan by August, the plan will somehow influence the budget of the following year. And if we miss the August deadline, that means that we will have a plan with no budget, at least for one full year. So in general, we need to make sure that we have a good plan. We need to make sure that we have a plan that was developed with the proper participation by all stakeholders. But if the plan has no funding, then it's going to stay just as a plan. No, so we need to make sure that we have enough funding. And the funding, like we said, could come mainly, not only from local money, from the national budget, but it should also come from international money. There is a lot of international money available, but you need to be organized in order to access that money. And that organization oftentimes is tricky. We were saying that, especially in developing countries, oftentimes the big limitation is that there's not enough organization within a government to prepare a proposal, to present the proposal, to follow through with the proposal, to get the money. And there we have a vicious circle, we were saying, in that oftentimes the poorer the country, the less capable that country is of following through with that process. A very good example can be seen in Central America. We have somebody here from Costa Rica. I met the person during lunch. Costa Rica is very well organized. They are very good in their government. Well, that's my opinion, at least compared to Guatemala. He probably has a different opinion. But Costa Rica is well organized to access international funding. And so a lot of international funding related to climate change comes to Costa Rica when we focus only on Central America. So Costa Rica really draws more of the funding compared to other Central American countries. But if you look at vulnerability, for example, Costa Rica is the least vulnerable of all the countries. And so the country that you could say, well, needs less money because it's less vulnerable, is the one that is getting more money because they are more organized to get that money. And so one question is, how do we organize the country that needs the money so that they have the capabilities of accessing that international money? So not only we have the problem of the availability of the funding, we have the bigger problem of how do we help the countries access that international funding. Okay? Now, you probably know this, but it's important to remember. The Paris Agreement sets a goal of $100 billion per year by the year 2020 from developed countries to help developing countries. So the Paris Agreement is asking developed countries to bring together $100 billion per year. We're going to see later that that figure actually came from an estimate from the World Bank. The World Bank estimated that developing countries needed about $100 billion per year to adapt to climate change. And so that's the figure that prevailed in the negotiations. And so that's what countries agreed to. So that's the agreement. Wealthy countries are going to provide $100 billion per year to help developing countries. The details on how that is going to be done are still to be worked out. And so we have now, from now until 2020, to figure out those details. So increasing the capabilities of smaller countries, poorer countries, to organize themselves to access those funding, that's going to be a big challenge to help those countries in their adaptation process. And then finally, interesting also to note that up to now, the focus of funding has been more on mitigation rather than adaptation. Okay? So if we study how much money internationally has been put into climate change, we see that about 20 to 1 for every dollar that has been spent on adaptation, about $20 has been spent on mitigation. And so the funding for mitigation is much higher, is much more readily available than the funding for adaptation. And that's something to keep in mind, because later we are going to talk about possible activities that help us to adapt at the same time that help us to mitigate. So those activities will have an advantage because we know that mitigation already has more funding available. And so that's something interesting to keep in mind. If we link up adaptation to mitigation, then we, at least at this moment, will have access to a higher level of funding. Okay? So with those two issues in mind about implementation, the difficulties in political and institutional arrangements, and the difficulties in terms of funding, Let's move now and talk about opportunities, constraints, and limits for adaptation. Okay? So we have basically three concepts. Two of them are related, opportunities and constraints. Okay? So opportunities refer to things that will help us promote adaptation in a society. So there are certain things already happening that will be to our advantage if we are in the business of promoting adaptation. That's an opportunity.
Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Why is funding? You say funding is more a lot
For
of funding
mitigation.
for mitigation.
Why is that?
Why is that? Because most of the
Mm-hmm. The question is, why do we have more funding for mitigation than for adaptation?
Yeah, because most of the countries, actually, the program of adaptation,
Mm-hmm.
it's more felt
Mm-hmm.
by the less developed countries,
Uh-huh.
which are vulnerable,
Uh-huh.
and currently they are contributing. They are like the major programs which are being started for carbon sinks, carbon credit. All of them, a lot of funding has been attributed to them in the guise of mitigation. But why is adaptation being...
I can only...
What is the politics around it?
I think it has to do in part with the history of climate change. No, I told you that at the beginning, the emphasis was on mitigation, and still the emphasis on mitigation. No, the climate change treaty, the climate change convention, like we saw, it basically focused on mitigation. No, so adaptation didn't come along until very recently, and so historically, the focus has been on mitigation, and therefore more funding has been directed towards mitigation. That's one reason, I think. The other reason, and again, that's my opinion, is because in mitigation, we are dealing with more concrete things that can be seen as business. No? So if we want to promote, for example, clean energy, if we want to promote solar energy in a country, there's certainly a company somewhere in the developed world that will be interested in selling those panels to the developing country. So it's more of a business transaction, and that's usually more easily done. Rather than thinking, well, we have this country and we need to help the country adapt to this situation. Well, what we've seen in the morning, adaptation is more of a fuzzy concept. Adaptation deals more with how the country is structured. We don't really know for sure what we need to do in terms of adaptation. So in general, the funding for adaptation is still in an earlier stage of understanding really what we want to fund, what kind of activity do we want to fund. And oftentimes, people argue, for example, adaptation to climate change is so closely related to development that it's hard to distinguish between the two, right? So some countries might argue, well, we are already helping adaptation because we're already providing funding for developing of the countries. And so it has been more tricky to identify individual funding for adaptation. And I think that's the other important reason why we see more funding geared from in mitigation rather than adaptation. Hopefully we'll see a shift in that in the future. But for the time being, that's the information we have. More money available for mitigation than for adaptation. And that actually is a constraint, no, to adaptation. Mm-hmm.
What about the nature of the adaptation and the mitigation in terms of, I will give an example. Let's suppose that the United States will spend $1 in a mitigation project in, I don't know, Costa Rica, for example. The impact will affect United States somehow. But if United States spend $1 in adaptation, will be locally, so the impact will be only in Costa Rica.
Yeah.
So there is
argument.
anything about it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So any investment in mitigation helps the entire planet, right? Because if I reduce emissions anywhere in the world, that reduction helps the entire planet because of the nature of the gases that we are talking about, no? So that's a good point. Mitigation is something where we are putting in money And even if we invest the money across the globe, sooner or later that money comes back to helping me. Whereas adaptation is more of a local situation. Although you could also argue that if you help your neighbor adapt, then you help your neighbor be better off, and you want to have your neighbor be a little bit happier if you don't want any security issues or problems. And so the more you realize that we live in a globalized society, the more you realize that adaptation will also help you in a certain way. But you're very right that it is more obvious to see that mitigation will help me more than adaptation, even if I do it in a different country. Okay, so opportunities, constraints, and limits. Opportunities, things that help us adapt. Constraints would be the opposite, things that work against us in terms of implementing adaptation. And limits is a constraint taken to the extreme, no? If a constraint becomes too hard, then we have a limit, because we cannot cross that, no? That would be as much adaptation as we can get. So we'll go into more details in this section. But before talking about opportunities for adaptation, it's important to go back to the concept of risk. In the morning, we discussed a lot about risk and how the incorporation of the concept of risk has changed our view in terms of adaptation. Well, it so happens that the perception that people have of a given risk has to do a lot with how that person, how that community is going to try to adapt to reduce that risk. In other words, if I don't perceive that that risk is important to me or to my community, I will have less of an incentive to do something to change that risk. But if I perceive that the risk is very important, then I have more of a drive to do something about it. There can be an extreme case, and we're going to mention that in a minute, where the risk is so big that I feel overwhelmed by the risk, right? There's a point where we say, well, the risk is so big that there's nothing I can do about it, no? In the morning, we were talking about a meteorite hitting the Earth, no? So the risk is so big that for the majority of us, there is little we could do to prevent that. For some people, from some governments, they could figure something out about sending a ship to try to destroy the meteorite or things that you see in the movies. But in general, if the risk is too big, then we lose perception on how we could adapt to that risk. And that happens in climate change, no? When we talk to farmers about climate change, some people say, well, this seems to be an act of God, no? Or this seems to be something that is just way beyond us, so there's nothing I can do about it. And we get that answer from farmers, no? When we ask them, what are you doing about climate change? There's nothing I can do. I mean, this is too big for me, so there's nothing I can do to adapt. And so that's important, because risk perception helps me to try to do something to adapt, but if the risk perception is too extreme, then it may end up giving me a perception that I cannot do anything about it. Okay? So basically, a key objective of adaptation is to avoid intolerable risks. Okay? So an opportunity for adaptation then lies in the fact that many groups of people are always trying to minimize risk. So if we focus on risk, important opportunity here is that, again, what we were saying in the morning, risk is something that has been in the minds of people for a long time. Insurance companies deal with risk all the time, and they have done so for many, many years. And so focusing on risk is an easy way to understand how people can react or cannot react to something. So we, with that in mind, we decided in one project that we did in Mesoamerica to ask farmers, so what do you think gives you a problem? What is a source of risk, a source of problems in your situation? And we asked that in 2 different years, in 2003 and 2007. Now, the dates are important because if you remember, I told you the story that the decade of 2000 was a decade of many extreme events happening through Mesoamerica. And so when we first asked them the question, what's producing risk to your life, what is giving you a risky situation in your life, in 2003, people had only experienced one big hurricane, which was Mitch. And like I told you before, Mitch actually went through in certain areas where it didn't cause much devastation, at least in Guatemala. In Honduras, it created more devastation. But in general, Mitch was very strong, but not so much in terms of actually producing a disaster. And so when we asked in 2003 to farmers, what's important to you in your life, then the response about climate was relatively low, no? So people were saying, yeah, the climate or the weather is important, but not so much. Actually, people said in Central America, because we were talking to coffee growers, so people were answering, well, we worry about the climate, but not the climate here in Central America. We worry about the climate in Brazil. Because if Brazil has a bad weather or bad climate in 1 year, then we get to sell our coffee, no? So they were more interested in the climate in Brazil than the climate in Guatemala, because Brazil is the biggest competitor in terms of selling coffee. And so in the first time we asked farmers, the perception that climate was a problem was low. The main source of risk was prices, markets, no? The coffee prices fluctuate a lot. Some years they are very high, some years they are very low. And so that presents a lot of risk to farmers, no? They really don't know what's happening to prices. They really don't know how they're going to change. And so they are really worried about prices. Interestingly, also, they were very worried about their own health, being healthy. If I get sick, then my public health systems in my countries, in Mesoamerica we are talking here, are so bad that I'm going to have a hard time recovering my health. And so people are really worried about getting sick, because if they get sick, they lose their productivity. And so we see that in 2003, the two main drivers of risk for people were market fluctuations or economical issues and healthy or health issues. Climate was low. Then we asked the same question 4 years later, 2 hurricanes later, right, including Mitch. And Mitch, like I explained to you, went through Mexico. So it really devastated the southern part of Mexico and the western part of Guatemala. And together with that, we had other hurricanes going through Central America. And so it was interesting that those hurricanes were enough to change the perception. So 4 years later, when we asked the same question, what are factors that are producing risk in your life, then weather and climate was much higher. That was interesting. But it was also very interesting to see that even after several hurricanes going through the area, still market and prices were the number one situation that was producing risk to the communities. And so if we are talking about adaptation to climate change, we have to realize that people are going to be thinking, yes, I need to adapt to climate change, but I also need to adapt to other situations that are giving me a hard time, right? And so I don't understand how the climate is changing, a farmer might say, but I don't understand how the markets are changing either. And I don't understand why 1 year they are paying me a lot for my coffee and the next year they are not paying me that much for my coffee. And so I would like to also reduce that risk if possible. And so we have to realize that, in this case at least farmers, but in general people, we all live in a world where we have risks coming from different situations. And so climate change is just one more thing added to a situation where we have different risks. Okay? Also interesting, pests and infestations was relatively low and remained low. And this is interesting because that happened right at the beginning of a very strong infestation of roya, which is a fungus affecting coffee, coffee rust, they call it in English. And so we were saying, well, how come you're not so much worried about pests? If we see that we are having problems with pests. And people were saying, well, yes, we know that pests are a problem, but we have lived with pests throughout our lives. No, we grew up with pests. And so we know how to handle pests. And so that gives us a perception that, yeah, that's a risk, but I know how to handle it. And therefore, I put it in a lower perspective, in a lower importance compared to other risks. climate, like I was saying, to many of them was something so big that they didn't know what to do about. When we asked them, how can you adapt to climate change? They're like, wow, we cannot do anything about climate. No, climate is so big that there are no tools that I have to adapt to climate. Whereas pests, even though they are very incident, I do have knowledge and tools to try to deal with that situation. So the risk is related not only to how important, how strong the impact is on my life, but it's also related to how much do I feel, or how many tools do I feel I have to cope with that situation. No? If I feel that I cannot really cope with the situation, like with, for example, market fluctuations, then that provides me with a lot of risk. And that gives me more of my nights without sleep. Okay? Here. Okay. Very quickly. So we saw that people were answering that they were worried about climate, not only climate in Brazil now, but local climate. So we asked them, so what worries you? And again, the questions were asked a decade ago. And of course, the main problem they reported were storms. Okay? And that was understandable because it was a decade with a lot of storms happening in the area. They also reported drought, but in a lower percentage. Of course, if we were to repeat the study now, most likely the bars here will go smaller and the drought bar will go higher. No? And that seems like a trivial commentary, but it's an important commentary. No? For example, in Guatemala, the German government is helping communities to adapt. And so they wanted to do a local adaptation, bottom-up planning of the adaptation. So they went to the communities in a specific area of the country and asked people, so what are your problems? What do you want to adapt to? And they asked that question 2 years ago. What did people answer, you think? We have a problem of drought, no? Because that was their main problem. And that's important. So German cooperation is helping farmers adapt to drought. But that was 2 years ago. Most likely, next year, we're going to have a problem of flooding because this year already we had normal rain, and next year we'll probably have excessive rain. And so it is important because even the local situation, which we said in the morning was important, we need to have a local planning. Sometimes our local knowledge might be a little bit limited in terms of our perspective, no? So my problems right now are this, but I have to see that 5 years ago I had another problem which was different, and in 2 years I might have the same problem because we have a cyclical situation. And so it's important that we can put a lot of emphasis in trying to solve one specific problem like drought without thinking that in a few years we're going to have the completely opposite problem, in this case flooding. And so we have to realize that we live in this cyclical situation and we have to address both the storms and the droughts. Pests, we talk about pests, incidents of pests. People were reporting, yes, now we see more pests. 95% of the farmers said, yes, we see an increment in the impact of pests. Many of them thought it was related to climate, right? They said that pests seem to be more abundant and aggressive. So again, it's a perception. We still have to measure that. We went back and tried to measure the incidence of pests. That's more tricky to do. But at least the perception was that there were more pests, and they seem to be related to changes in the climate. And again, perceptions are important because the perception is what's going to make me react or not to the specific problem. So that's an opportunity. If people are perceiving that there is a problem, then I have a better chance of working with that people, with that group of persons, to try to do something about the problem. Okay? So farmers, in this case, we were working only with farmers, with coffee growers. Farmers are always adapting to a changing climate, no? So we don't need to come and talk to them about adaptation to changing conditions. They always do it. They are used to that all the time. They are always adapting to changing conditions. And so farmers are a good group, an easy group to say so, to work with in terms of climate change because they are already doing a lot to try to adapt. With farmers, we have then what we call autochthonous practices, or practices that are already within the group, things that they are already doing to try to adapt. And what we need to do is to try to complement those practices with technology that can help them adapt to more extreme situations. So farmers are always used to adapting to a changing climate, but the problem now is that the climate is changing more than what they were used to. And sometimes the climate is changing in ways that they don't understand. No, some of you were reporting in the morning the rainy season is changing too much. Now it's harder to predict when it's going to start the rainy season. And so what we need to do is to try to use the knowledge and the practices that they have and try to complement that with additional knowledge so they have better tools to try to deal with this changing environment. Important here then is to rescue practices that might have been forgotten, including the use of genetic diversity in crops. For many years, for example, farmers were taught to only crop one thing, at least in Guatemala, that was the drive in the 80s or in the 90s, okay, focus on coffee, focus on this, focus on that, because that will give you more money. Or to focus on one single variety of coffee. The extreme of that is to focus, for example, in a single variety. If we have a specific variety that was developed by genetically modifying it to be more productive, for example. So we can have a field in which we have almost no variety. All the plants look the same because they were developed by modifying them genetically. So that's the extreme case, of almost zero variability. So perhaps that was not the best idea, because we developed this plant to be optimum under these conditions. But now we see that the conditions are changing so much that the optimum that we thought was the best now is not the best anymore because it's changing too much. And so perhaps rather than thinking of a single crop or thinking of a single species or thinking of a single variety of a species, perhaps we need to go back and think about many different varieties, In Guatemala specifically, and that's the same case in other countries in Latin America. In Guatemala, corn, for example. Corn is important because all communities grow corn in rural areas. Corn was originated in the southern part of Mexico, the northern part of Guatemala. And so the genetic variation of corn is extremely high, and communities are used to managing different types of corn, but throughout the years, some of that knowledge had been lost. So we are trying to recover some of that knowledge, because people already knew that they had 10 different varieties of corn, and this corn is good for dry weather, this corn is good for hot weather, this corn is good for rainy weather. And so if we are able to recover that knowledge, then we are in a good way helping farmers to adapt to a more changing environment. Okay. Okay, and the last comment we already said, many farmers said to us, well, climate change is too big, we cannot do anything about it. And so that's a difficult situation also, when people say, well, I'm not going to do anything about it because it's too much. So we have to tell them, well, there might be some things that you can do about it. Let's try to think about what you can do, because it's not necessarily God doing this to you, So, but that's a tricky situation, Okay. We said that farmers were already doing a lot of things, So we asked farmers, so what are you doing now? And these are some of the things that farmers reported as doing, They were doing agroforestry practices, they were leaving crops residues in the field, they were composting and a bunch of things. They were managing the shade, that was the most common response. They also had some soil conservation practices. And you see here two colors, The green bar are farmers that follow certification programs for coffee production, and the yellow bars are farmers that don't follow any certification process. And so it wasn't surprising to see that the farmers following certification programs had a lot of different practices, because the certification programs usually demand those practices. The surprise was to see that the non-certified farmers also had a wide range of practices. And in many cases, the non-certified farmers also had very similar practices to the certified ones. And when we ask them, so why are you doing all these things? Many of them answer, well, I saw my neighbor doing it, and it worked for him, so I'm going to do it. I decided to do it myself. So the neighbor was certified, and he was doing that because the certification process asked him to do it, and then the neighbors benefited from that because they saw that it worked and they were doing it. And so we see here that in general the conclusion is that, like I said before, farmers are always ready to try new things, to try to adapt to a changing environment. And so farmers are an excellent group in which we can just add a few more things to help them adapt to a changing situation. I also circle here two practices: shade coffee, managing the shade of coffee, opening or closing the shade, and soil conservation. These two are important practices because they are adaptation practices, but they are also adaptation practices. No? If we increase the shade of the coffee, we are actually increasing the carbon stored in the coffee plantation, so that is helping mitigation. If we protect the soil from eroding, then we are protecting the carbon in the soil from being lost to the atmosphere. And so these two are practices that farmers are already doing, but these two are practices that are helping both with adaptation, but also with mitigation. And so these are two practices that are ideal in that sense, no? A win-win situation.
The farmers have to pay to certify.
Yeah, so that's a question, no? If these farmers are not certified, but they do all the practices, why don't they get certified? And the barrier is the payment, right? When we ask these farmers, why are you not certified if you're doing everything? Because I don't want to pay. There's a fee to get certified, and the answer was, well, the fee is high enough, and the fee doesn't change my price too much. And so they didn't see a benefit in paying that fee because the increase in payment in prices they will see was not equivalent to paying that fee. And so that's one of the reasons why these farmers did not get certified. But yeah, there's a barrier here to certification in terms of payment. Okay, so adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity then is influenced by the ability of different actors to capitalize on available opportunities that ease the planning and implementation of adaptation, as well as constraints that make adaptation processes more difficult for both human and natural systems. So basically what we're saying here is what you discussed amply yesterday, you know? Different groups will have different options, and different groups will have different capacities to use those options. Even within a country, no? We are not talking about different countries. We are talking within the same country. One group might be better off at taking advantage of circumstances, and other groups might be better off at taking advantage of different circumstances, no? And so we see that adaptive capacity changes a lot among groups, even within a country. Opportunities and constraints then are unevenly distributed among global regions, communities, sectors, ecological systems, and species, as well as across different time periods. And so when we talk about opportunities and constraints, we have to realize that we are not talking about a uniform situation, no? Within a country, we see different communities with different opportunities and constraints. Within a community, even, we see groups of people who will have more opportunities, groups of people who will have more constraints. So we have to realize that. And even opportunities and constraints can change during time. Something that might be an opportunity now might be a constraint in the future, or vice versa. So that's also important. An adaptation that might be useful now might not be useful in the future, or vice versa. So adaptation is also something that is dynamic as well. And going back to the planning that we talked about in the morning, the planning of adaptation, of course, cannot be static. The planning that we finally approve in Guatemala after so many painful years of discussion, when we approve it, it's not going to be useful anymore because the circumstances change, no? We started the plan when we were talking about excessive rain, and then we started to get all this dryness. Now we have all the dryness, but then we're going to get excessive rain again. And so we have to make sure that our adaptation plans are dynamic enough to adjust to these different conditions that we are observing. Now, yesterday, I believe you talked a lot about poverty and vulnerability, development, and reduction of risk. This is just to remind you that wealth plays a big role in risk management. This is a graph that comes from a report by UNDP. UNDP produces these reports on Human Development Index. I'm sure you've seen those, no? That's a number that is ranking countries around the globe related to how much development we see within a specific country. So in 2007, their report focused on climate change. And so they had graphs like this. And this graph is showing basically the risk of being impacted by a natural disaster. Now, we discussed this in the morning, no? Are disasters natural or not? Well, in here, they are still using the term natural disaster. I was telling you that in the scientific community, they are trying to move away from the term natural disaster, although there is some argument that some disasters are still natural. But anyway, in the 80s, the risk of being impacted by a disaster, this much. Every circle represents 50 persons for 100,000 inhabitants in a country. The red circles represent developing countries, and the black circle represents developed countries. So in the 80s, developed countries only had 50 for every 100,000 inhabitants in developed countries. But developing countries had all these people. No, the risk was way higher. Now, that's bad already. But what is worse is that was in the 80s. If we move into the 2000s, then the risk in developed countries basically remained the same, no? Even though climate became more severe in the last years, the risk for developed countries pretty much remains the same, whereas the risk for developing countries doubles or almost doubles, no? And so, again, we see that the risk is closely related to the level of development of wealthy countries. By the way, the wealthy countries in this case are indicated by countries that belong to the OCDE, no? The Organización de Cooperación et Développement Économique. I don't speak French, as you can see. But it's basically the organization of countries that promote development. It's basically the group of 35 countries that account for 80% of the wealth of the country. No? So the wealthiest countries of the world have only this low risk level. No? This was reported by Stern. No? This guy Stern became very famous because he was the first economist to really deal with climate change issues. For many years, economists were not really that interested in dealing with climate change. Stern, an economist from United Kingdom, did his review in 2006. And he concluded that. No, he concluded, well, the poorest countries will suffer earliest and most, even though they have contributed least to the cause of climate change. And so this sentence created a big revolt and realization in the world. Well, we are talking here about a very unfair situation. No, we are talking in a situation where the countries that didn't cause the problems are the countries that are bearing the cost of the problems. And so how do we make this more fair? And from that year on, we started to see more and more of this language in the negotiations. No? How do we make sure that the country that created the problem help the country that are bearing the burden of the problem adapt to that situation? A little bit more on poverty. Just to remind you, this is just for Latin America. But poverty is a big situation in Latin America and in many places of the world. No? In the morning, we were talking about problems. When I ask you, rather than climate change, what are more immediate problems in your countries? And some of you said poverty, no? Well, in Latin America, in some countries, it's a big problem. The light green bar represents extreme poverty. The dark green bar represents poverty. So in some countries, these two bars, green and light green, go as high as 70%. No? This is Honduras. This is Nicaragua. This is Paraguay, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Bolivia, no? So we see that in the top 5 countries, what we see is that 4 out of the 5 countries fall in Central America. So we see that poverty is closely focused in the Central American region, at least compared to the rest of the countries in Latin America. And so that has been cited often as a situation that is producing the high vulnerability of population in Central America, not only to climate change, but to other problems, no? The high levels of poverty in Central America. Now, this is a situation that it has been in place, has been existing in Central America for many years, right? And so Central America has been very vulnerable because of these high poverty levels, but really that has nothing to do with climate change. That happened before, no? It's a historical situation. And so climate change just comes on top of that historical situation and makes the situation worse. But then some wealthy countries may argue, well, now you're asking me to help you adapt to climate change. But in order to help you adapt to climate change, I need to help you reduce that poverty. So are you really asking me to help you adapt to climate change, or are you asking me to help you in your developmental issues? And that is a tricky question, and that's a valid question that has been asked repeatedly. No? The funding for adaptation, is that really for adaptation or is that for development? Because if you want to increase your adaptive capacity, you have to reduce your development gaps, to say so. No? And so that has been in the discussion, and perhaps there's no easy answer to that, but basically the two of them are linked up together. But countries are fairly saying, well, you're asking me to help you adapt to climate change because I was responsible for climate change, say the rich countries, but I'm not responsible for your poverty situation. That was your own problem, your own internal problem. And so that's something to keep in mind. Adaptation to climate change is really done in the background of a big problem of poverty that already existed previously. Okay? So that's a constraint, no? We live in a society, especially in developing countries, where poverty levels are very high. At best, some of our countries have poverty levels of 30 or 40%, which are very high already. In countries like Guatemala, poverty levels are 50 to 60%. So over half of the population live under the poverty line. That's a big constraint. That could be seen as an opportunity also, right? Linking up the idea of development and adaptation, like what we are saying, no? Countries need money to adapt, but that money can also help in the development issues. In many countries, like in Guatemala, talk about inequality, talk about poor and rich, has always been a difficult situation, no? It created wars, like in many of your countries, no? For many years, that was even a forbidden discussion, no? Talk about why the poor are poor, why the rich are rich. And so for many years, that was something that was difficult to discuss. It's still difficult to discuss, but at least now we have an excuse, if you wish, to talk about it from a different perspective. So we are talking about poor and rich, not so much to discuss whether that was fair or not in the past, but to discuss that if we want to increase the resilience of the country, we need to do something about the poor in the country. No? So an opportunity, if you wish, is to see the problems of development in our countries as a way to solve and to work with adaptation issues. Okay? The region then needs to pay more attention to social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and equality. This is something we already mentioned in the morning. Climate change, again, is a long-term process. We are talking about adaptation in the future, 20, 30 years in the future, but we need to start taking steps right now. And so, again, development is a situation that is current. If we ask any countries, what are your main problems, we said in the morning, many of us say, well, poverty, no? Corruption also. And they go hand in hand, actually. So if we want to attack poverty, which is a current problem, we are helping to solve a problem in the future in terms of climate change. Please. Qué bueno, así descanso yo.
So I have like a doubt, because if you tell developed countries that they should help developing countries to develop, then you're kind of saying that they need to help also to improve the climate change effects, because development, as we have nowadays, means that you have to consume more and means that you need to use more resources.
Exactly.
So you are, on the other hand, improving climate change. So it's quite controversial.
Exactly.
And then I don't know, but from my point of view, I guess we need a new system, like in general, an economic system, so that it's sustainable, because this is the basis.
No, very good point. Two important points here. One is we need new ways of development, no? And so, for example, the Convention on Climate Change came up with concepts like clean developed mechanisms, no? How do we think of new mechanisms to develop developing countries in a clean way, right? Don't make them follow the same path that the developed countries follow, because that was a not so clean path. That's one issue. And the other issue that you raised, which is very important, and I remember that was the first question that Maria Carmen asked you yesterday, what is development? No? What is the concept of development that we wish to have? Not that we have, that we wish to have, no? If I ask you, are you happy the way you are, or do you want to improve? Do you want to have more? Do you have less? What is the answer? No. What is the goal of development that we have? For many people, the goal of development is what they see in developed countries. But what do we see in societies like the U.S., for example? The consumption levels in the U.S., that have been studied a lot. If the whole world consumed at the level that the U.S. consumes, then we wouldn't have enough resources in the world, no? And so the question is, do we really want that for the rest of the world, or do we need to have new concepts of what a developed country is, no? We mostly come from developing countries here, I believe. So the question is, how do we envision our country 50 years from now? If we want to change our country from being developing to being a developed country, what does it look like, no? Any other comment, a quick comment on that? What you discussed that broadly yesterday, no? But what are the concepts of development? I mean, what would you like to see in your country as being developed? Can I have a microphone here in the back? And then, here in the front and then in the back.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. My question is a deviation. I want to know the major difference between climate change and climate variability.
You were supposed to ask that question last week, because last week you had the climatologist. What is the main difference between climate change and climate variability? Okay, let's listen to their question or comment, and then I'll try to answer.
So the idea of development, the way we have understood so far, it's a bit contentious. Particularly the way yesterday the class discussed that how one of the economists, Amartya Sen, has put forward it, that is development is nothing but facilitation and capability building. So that is a very grassroots way of looking at development. The way most of the world's countries understand development is the way we have progressed in history. Need not necessarily always be that development increases welfare. For example, what is happening now? The developed countries, they thought in the mid-40s, when just after the World War II, that this is the industrialization is the way to develop. But then see what is happening today. It is because of that action that we are thinking that, well, we are in a developed world, but we have a lot of issues also we have created for ourselves. So at any moment, this is my personal view, that at any moment, defining what is development is very difficult, because we may think that this technology, what we are developing today, is helping today, but it may create some other problem which we are not aware of today.
Exactly.
So it is a very tricky question, what is development?
Yeah.
It is difficult to answer.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Oftentimes, we think, well, we need more technology because technology is going to solve some of our problems. But technology oftentimes creates new problems that we are not even aware of. And actually, with climate change, we are talking about mitigation. I don't know if you have a class on mitigation, but when you start talking about mitigation, you start talking about managing the planet. No, one big discussion in terms of mitigation deals with actually changing our planet in drastic ways. For example, things as complex as adding mirrors in the space, no, to reflect the solar light and reduce the amount of light coming into the planet. And so those are technological solutions that might help in the short term, but who knows what's going to happen in the long term with those solutions. So we might have more problems in the future than solutions. That's related to the topic of geoengineering, no, that has been a lot of discussion about. But geoengineering is actually being considered very seriously, basically because we have the goal of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees if possible, and really all the scenarios show that it's going to be very hard to reach 2 degrees unless we start doing some geoengineering. So the only way really to keep the temperature to 2 degrees would be to stop polluting, but also to try to modify our planet to try to reduce some of the pollution that we already added to the atmosphere in ways like, for example, capturing that pollution and sending it to the bottom of the ocean, no? Carbon capture and storage, that's called. And that sounds feasible in practice, but we don't know what's going to happen. No? If we get all this carbon from the atmosphere and send it to the bottom of the ocean, we don't know what's going to happen there in the bottom of the ocean in the long term. And going back to your question, climate change and climate variability. Well, the definition of the convention is simple, no? We talk about anthropogenic climate change as the portion of the variability that was increased to the climate from our activities. And so we recognize that climate is always varying, but that variability has been increased by the activities of human beings. And so anthropogenic climate change relates to the increased variability coming from our activities. And that's what we are talking about here. Climate is always changing. So climate change has always existed, but in the past 200 years, anthropogenic activities have resulted in increased variability of the climate, and that's what we call anthropogenic climate change. Okay? So, constraints to adaptation. And this is a long list here. So these are 10 things that can make it harder to work with communities to adapt. It's a long list. The good news is that the constraints can become good things by just changing the focus of the problem. So, for example, if we have a knowledge constraint, that knowledge constraint can also become an opportunity if we rely on local knowledge, for example. And so this list can be seen as the constraints, but it can also be seen as the list of opportunities, depending on how we approach the problem. So these are different things that can make it harder to work with communities in terms of adaptation. And we're going to go quickly through the list because it's a long list, but we're going to start with knowledge and awareness. So it's a challenge, no? To increase the knowledge of the general population about the problem. How do we communicate the situation to the population at large? We have good scientific information, right? We have these IPCC reports and we have other kinds of reports. If we put them all together, we'll stack up literature to this high probably, no, from the floor. So we have a lot of information, but how do we send that information to the general public? That's a challenge, sure. When we talk about the general public, we can think of at least 3 important groups. We would like to approach policymakers, leaders, national leaders, and try to make them understand a little bit more about what's happening with the climate. We would like to approach practitioners, meaning technical people who are working with local communities to help them. So people who are in the field trying to help communities to adapt. We also want to talk to community leaders and try to give them more information. And this is important to understand, because when we talk about communication, we have to realize that the person at the other side has a different objective, has a different level of education, has a different background, and so our communication has to be different, right? We cannot think of one solution for everybody. And so if we want to communicate to a policymaker, we don't do it the same way as we communicate to a practitioner, and we don't do it the same way as we communicate to community leaders. Now, that's a big challenge for scientists, no? Because we are trained in a different kind of communication. All our education is oriented towards producing a scientific paper, right? Not a communication for a policymaker or for a practitioner or a community leader. And so we are being trained to communicate to scientists. So what do we do? Well, there are different options. One option is to train you in different kinds of communication. That could be done. It's a little bit tricky because you already are very busy, I'm sure, no? With a lot of classes, with a lot of exams, so you don't want one more class on communication. But that's a possibility. And that I encourage you to do that, to start thinking, well, how can I learn new tools to communicate to different people? But if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to learn more communication skills to other people, what you could do is talk to communication experts, you know? And what you could do is, in your research programs, in your research projects, add a component that deals with communication, you know? And this is something that is probably fairly recent, but it's something that we are trying to promote more and more with funding agencies, you know? I'm here because one of the funding agencies for the program is the IAI, no? Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. I've been funded by IAI. The coffee project that you saw there was funded by IAI. And now I'm part of the scientific committee of the IAI. And what we are trying to promote is that all projects funded by IAI have a specific component on communication, because we are seeing that more and more that's the big limitation of scientific projects. No? We produce excellent knowledge, but the knowledge is being distributed only in scientific papers to other scientists. It's not reaching community leaders, it's not reaching political leaders. And so we don't want to burden scientists with more activities. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to encourage scientists who write proposals to add a component in the proposal, and IAI is committed to fund that line related to communication, you know, related to hiring a specialist on communication. And that's important because you really need to have some specific knowledge to develop good communication tools. And I brought here some examples of what we did with the coffee project. I'm going to circulate them so you can take a look at them. But communicating to decision makers, the usual way that we do that is by policy briefs, no? Still not effective, but we still do it. And it works in a way, no? So this is a summary for policymakers. So this is a 4-page summary of a 100-page report, scientific report. And this is trying to summarize the knowledge for a decision maker at a high level. Still doesn't work that well because this is still too much to read, oftentimes for policymakers, no? But it works, so it's still useful to have. It's when you come to talk to a politician, it's good to have something that you hand in and like, this is me, no, this is what I do. So he can at least see the pictures and he can see you there in the field, so he can believe that you're a scientist, no? And so it has its place in it. But still, it's difficult to convince a policymaker just with this. You need to convince them with additional tools. But this is something that you can use, a policy brief. But the other audiences that we have there, practitioners and community leaders, that's harder. In our coffee project, we wanted to communicate our results to the coffee farmers. If you can circulate that, that'll be great. So we came up with reports that were written specifically for the farmers. Now, we didn't have the time or we didn't have the skills to produce these reports because the idea here was to use the scientific report and to write it again in a non-scientific language. And we are so good at writing in scientific language that it's impossible, almost impossible for us to move away from scientific language. So in both cases, we hired outside people. We hired communication specialists to mediate, that's the technical word they use, no? Mediation of the technical report to come up with reports that are written in a language, and also the diagrams in the report are useful to be more attractive, hopefully, to farmers. And so these are two other products that we came up with to try to communicate our information to coffee farmers. We went even beyond that, and my favorite are these two over here. These two look the same, but they are different. They are calendars. We came up with an idea of the calendar. Actually, probably the communicator told us this idea, not us. So this was important because basically what we did is we came up with a calendar in which here at the bottom we send a key message to the farmer. And hopefully that message was related to the month of the year. So hopefully the message was related to something they needed to do in that month. And so there was a way to try to send key messages to the farmers. And the good thing about this is that they would hang the calendar in their houses. They loved the calendar because it's useful. And it was attractive, I think, to look at. But within the calendar, we had some key messages being distributed to farmers. And so these things, again, are useful for communication. And if we want to develop those tools, the best option is to really hire a specialist. No? One more thing I want to show you. We also did a poster. Posters were very useful in Central America. Again, many people in rural areas like to decorate their houses with things like this. You probably wouldn't put this up in your living room, but people were very happy when we gave them this. It was colorful. It had pictures, so they liked to put it up in their living room. And this is like a summary of the project, no? So in one single poster, we have the key messages from our project being transmitted to the farmers. Now, it might have helped, it might have not helped. We didn't do an evaluation of whether this was useful or not, but at least we tried, and we tried by hiring a specialist, because we didn't have the skills or the time to do this. So the key message is, if you want to communicate, then try to hire a specialist. No, if your budget allows it, then do it. If you're writing a proposal, think about adding that line on communication. No, that will add a lot. One last document that I wanted to share with you was this little document that we produced, I think it was early this year. And this is called The Most Frequent Questions on Climate Change. And this is something that I thought about putting together after giving so many lectures about climate change in Guatemala. And so in Guatemala and other countries in Central America, I would come and give a lecture to the general public, and oftentimes I saw the same questions over and over, being asked. And so I figured, well, if I put together a document where I describe those questions, that might be useful. And so this is, again, another attempt of trying to explain to the general public the situation of what is happening here. Now, even with all of these tools, we still have a humongous task before us. In Guatemala, we have 16 million people. That's how many people here in Sao Paulo, I think, no? So we have to communicate to 16 million people. This is not enough. No, we cannot produce 16 million calendars or 16 million pamphlets. And that's why we need to rely on mass communication, on news, on media, on reporters. If we are able to get reporters on our side and get them interested in these topics, then we might have a better opportunity to reach out to a larger group. But in general, knowledge and awareness is probably one of the most important things for making sure that people at least know what is happening, and at least giving them the chance to decide whether they want to do something about it or not. No? If they don't know about it, then they might not even have that opportunity. But if we give them the information, they might have the opportunity to decide whether they want to do something about it or not.
Thank you, Prof.
Oh, here's the microphone.
Yes, I want to note that in as much as the use of posters, leaflets, and other things is very good, it has its own limitation. For an uneducated set of people, it's better to use more pictorial representations.
Yeah.
And that is the challenge we have at our hand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, that's very true. In Guatemala, we have half of the people under the poverty line and about 1/3 of the population who cannot read or write. The government says that it's lower, but it's about 1/3, I think. And so, yeah, how do we reach out to that 1/3 of the population who cannot read? These materials are not good. So radio is a very good way to communicate, no? Radio messages. We have tried messages. We do have some radio spots derived from the calendar and from the poster. So that's a good way. The other important thing here, in Guatemala and in many countries, they are trying this. Cell phones are a very useful way to distribute messages. No, cell phones are very common now, especially in rural areas. I don't know if that's the same in your countries, but in Guatemala, there are more cell phones than people already, and you can be in the most remote area and you will find people with cell phones. No, and so if you want to reach out to people, then cell phone messages are a good way to do so. The biggest challenge we have found so far with sending messages over the cell phone is to try to come up with specific messages that are suited for specific areas. Because even in a small country like Guatemala, we might have very different situations in different parts of the country, no? And we have seen that over and over every year. I was telling you that, for example, in the last years we had a drought. But really the drought was more focused on the south central part of the country. The northern part was still flooding while we had the drought in the south. And so we couldn't send a general message about drought. We had to try to figure out a way to send flooding messages to the people in the north and drought messages to people in the south. That's very tricky because phone companies really don't know where their phones are located. But what we need to develop there is a list of phone numbers for leaders. And that takes a lot of time, but that's something that we have been working on, trying to come up with long list of leaders and their phone numbers. So we send information to specific leaders in specific areas depending on the needs for that specific area. So cell phones are also a good way, but they do require a little bit more work to make them more. There's a question back there.
Okay.
They do require more information to make them a useful tool. Mm-hmm.
Yes, in this communication, I work in Mozambique, and Mozambique have 32 languages, official languages.
How many?
32.
Ah.
And Portuguese.
In Guatemala, we have 24, so you.
Yes. So, and Portuguese, that is the national language, is not the main one with the communities I work. And I found that sometimes from one community, 100 kilometers from another one, fishing communities, they speak different language, different religions. Mm-hmm. And I found that perhaps hiring a communicator to communicate what I want is probably not the best option, because that person will come from Putu, that is the national capital, that is like 2,000 kilometers away from me.
Yeah.
But probably sitting with the people and asking what they feel about it, and then themselves in the community are the persons that giving the message. So they digest the leaders and the persons, a restricted group of persons digest the message and send it in the way that makes sense to them, not to me or...
Yeah.
And I found singing songs and theater work very well.
Huh.
because
I saw that
I
also.
can't
We
do
did that one
anything.
time with puppets. Theory with puppets worked very well for us at some point.
So you just work, for instance, with some ladies that like show business. You know, they like to sing and do theater, and you give them the theme of sustainable fishing. You know, they should use certain gears, and then they come up with a theater in the way they make sense to them. And this is my experience. It was a little bit of sharing.
But you raise a very important point that in many countries we have multi-language situations that makes it extremely tricky. There's one more question in the back. You can send it back there. And are we moving those? Move those to the back, the materials. But yeah, multi-language situation is very complex. I was telling you that in Guatemala we have over 20 languages, and so that makes it very complicated. We tried already, and we are doing it, translating some of this material into local languages. That helps a little bit, but most of the people cannot read or write in their own language, because they are usually oral languages, and so it becomes a tricky situation. In many languages, they don't have some of the concepts related to climate change, right? Some languages don't have a word for climate change, and so first we need to figure out how to convey the message and how to make them understand as close as possible what we want to say, like you were saying. So it's a tricky situation for sure.
So I totally agree on the importance of communication to other sectors, but as we do those kind of efforts, my question is how can we convince all the researchers to who evaluate us for scholarships, projects or whatever, to validate those efforts and not only number of papers?
Yes, well, that's a very good question, and that's not only within a university, but also with the donor agencies, for example. Oftentimes, donor agencies rank projects in the number of publications that they have. In our specific case, for example, I was telling you about this coffee project funded by IAI. IAI funds these large projects throughout the continent, and once a year they will bring all the leaders of the project and bring us together for a meeting. And I would listen to some of these leaders say, well, this year we published 10 papers in journals, and this year we published 20 papers. And I was like, oh, this year we published 1 paper or 2 papers. But I have these calendars, and I have these reports. And actually, I saw that people were very responsive. Many people were saying, like, wow, that's great. I mean, let me look at it, and I wish I could produce something like this. So it's slowly changing, but you're very right. Oftentimes, these kind of publications that I'm distributing here are seen like, this is nothing. I mean, this is not useful, or this is not science, right? And so we hire you to do science, so we want papers. And the higher the ranking of the journal, the better. And there's some truth to that, but of course, we need to have our science communicated to the general public. And so what we need to do is to convince universities and to convince funding agencies that science communication is also important, so that they recognize that effort. And again, at least within the IAI, which is the institution where I'm working more closely, we are doing that. We are putting enough value on this kind of publication, similar to scientific publication. We are coming close to the end of the first period in the afternoon. I just want to close with the discussion about local languages, about local knowledge, about traditional knowledge, about indigenous knowledge. That has always been a challenge when it comes to climate change. And IPCC has been an institution that, at least in the discourse, has been open to including indigenous knowledge. In practice, it has been extremely difficult to do so. So when we started the 5th report, we really had an effort to try to include more of the indigenous knowledge, more of the traditional knowledge into the assessment. In practice, it's very tricky, in part because most of the traditional or indigenous knowledge is only in oral format, no? And And so a lot of that knowledge is only transmitted by word of mouth. And so there is nothing really written about the knowledge. And like I said at the beginning, IPCC basically assesses the published literature. So IPCC can only cite something that is published somewhere. So if I have this knowledge that is only oral, how can I talk about it? No? And so that's a big challenge. We had an effort. With a group of people, we came up with several symposia where we brought indigenous leaders together with scientists who were interested in these topics, and we were trying to have the scientists capture some of the knowledge to translate it into papers. So we were trying to trick the system. No? We were trying to produce some papers based on the knowledge that these indigenous leaders were giving us, so that we had some places where we could cite the knowledge. And we were more or less successful. After the break, I can show you a book that we published, a small book with a summary of papers coming from the knowledge that we were able to gather from different indigenous leaders. So we are starting to do that, but still tricky to do, no? And to many scientists, that's something that is not valuable. To many scientists, when we talk about traditional knowledge, it's like, that's not really science, no? And it is and it is not, no? A lot of the traditional knowledge is mixed with the local culture, with local beliefs that might go beyond science, might go into the spiritual realm, for example. But there is a lot of truth there that can be useful if we want to talk about adaptation, no? And I wrote there so I wouldn't forget. The best example is the example of the Inuits, no? The Inuits working with ice in the polar regions, no? I'm sure our friend from Russia can help us hear more, but basically, or Siberia, no? Basically, I understand that Inuits have a very specific knowledge and language to describe ice, no? So they don't have a single word for ice. They have many words to describe how the ice looks, no? And so that's an important knowledge. And when they go out hunting, they have a lot of oral knowledge transmitted from father to children about how to observe the changing weather. No, if you are out there in the region in the polar regions, I've never been there, but I'm sure it's pretty drastic. So you are out there risking your life if you get caught in the middle of a storm. So they have a lot of oral knowledge transmitted in terms of how to read the different variables around you to see what's happening with the weather. And so that's a traditional knowledge that seems extremely useful for adapting to a changing environment. Now, very interesting because some of that traditional knowledge now is being lost, in part because more people are now relying on national forecasts. And so it's very interesting that the national forecast here is competing with the local knowledge. And many young people especially rely more on the national forecast than on the things that their grandparents told them about how to read their surrounding variables. And so we have here a competing situation, no? Ideally, we would have both knowledges work together. Maybe the traditional knowledge now under more extreme weather is not working that well anymore, but there is some basis to it that can still be useful if we complement it with a forecast from the National Weather Service. And so it's important to think about indigenous and traditional knowledge. Let's not just say, no, that's not science, it's not useful. There's some important information there that can be very useful for people to adapt to extreme situations. So let's always be open to try to figure that out, how to incorporate that knowledge into our own knowledge. It's just knowledge that is being produced under a different system, no? It's just a different system of thinking, a different system of seeing the world, but that doesn't make it invalid, no? That's still valid knowledge. But because it's being produced under a different system, again, it's very challenging to try to add it to a process like the IPCC, no? But again, we are working on it. We are hoping that in the next assessment, we'll have more and more of this local knowledge being incorporated into the assessment. Okay. Okay, so with that comment, we're going to finish for the break, and then we'll be back here in about 25 minutes to start with the last session, if I have a voice to finish. Thank you. And you can continue looking at the materials. Just, I need those back because I only have one copy left, so unfortunately I cannot give them to you.